All right, moving right along. I know on the local economic development side, funding is never a topic of conversation, so bear with us as we talk about this dry subject. Up next, aligning strategy and funding for economic development organizations. Help me welcome to the stage Andy Coe and Chuck Sexton. Andy is with Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. They are a national consultancy focused on developing sustainable funding strategies and raising capital for organizations looking to improve involvement and investment from their constituencies. Chuck was named CEO of the Next Move Group in 2022. They're involved in both the site selection side and also personnel recruitment. So please welcome to the stage, Chuck and Andy.
There's Chuck.
You okay? Can I get you?
Yeah, I'm golden. Sorry, I got a phone call. All right, am I mic'd up? Perfect. All right, sorry about that. So I appreciate the fact that Scott introduced the fact that we do site selection, and that's one of my big passions is doing site selection, but also strategic planning. And so I'm excited to be able to talk with Andy today and talk to you all about taking strategic planning and relating it to funding. My big question is, do we have a presentation that's going to be up here? Because it's not.
Ruh-roh.
Cool. All right, so
There we go.
as we get started, is that the clicker, by the way? Scott? Man, room cleared out. Perfect. It's my favorite. So, how many of you in here have done a strategic plan in the last year? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you have aligned your strategic plan in order to increase funding for your EDO, for your economic development organization? I see Dave. All right. Okay. So, one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough as practitioners, as professionals, is how important it is to make sure that your strategic plan is leading the results of your organization, but also informing what the funding is necessary for your organization to be successful. And at the end of this, we're going to talk about why that is. Convergent Nonprofit Solutions and Next Move Group have partnered on this presentation in order to make sure that at least people are aware of the fact that you can go through a seamless process of strategic planning all the way through to your funding and having your feasibility study in the middle of that. So your strategic plan, and if you see Q2 up there, by the way, I didn't want to put too many words. A Q2 analysis on strategic planning means qualitative and quantitative. And there's an importance to that. Qualitative is very important because that's what engages your stakeholders. Your stakeholders are the ones who are going to fund your organization long term. And then, of course, your feasibility study is going to tell you, it's going to test the market on your strategic plan and those stakeholders to figure out if you can get the funding that's necessary to implement that plan long term. And then, of course, going ahead with the fundraising campaign. So why should you have a comprehensive economic development strategy? And when I say that, I don't want you to think of a development district. So everybody does a SEDS with their development districts. Anybody ever been involved with that before? So they get their EDA funding? That's not what this is. This is a comprehensive plan specific to an EDO that needs to find that private sector funding and public sector funding. I think that's sometimes a misnomer too. It's not just about getting private sector. It's about making sure that your community partners, because some of you may be in a community where you have multiple municipalities that fund you. Anybody have a strat plan that sits on the shelf? Have you ever experienced that before? Just sits there and never gets used? Doesn't go anywhere, right? Why? Why don't they work? Most plans, your board doesn't have basic knowledge of economic development practices. They're not bought in. They're not bought into the fact that your strategy is what's going to drive results for your community because they don't understand best practices in economic development. Part of our process as a company, now look, processes can be similar across a lot of different strategic planning, but ours, we make sure that we are doing education on best practices as a part of that process, because that helps you get the strategies that you need. I was actually just talking to Jason about this a minute ago. When we go into a community and we have those stakeholder sessions, which are very key from the funding perspective, we sit down and do basically an ED 101 on what their role is, what's most important in economic development for success long term, so that their minds are ready for that stakeholder session one-on-one that we do, for them to understand what they need to talk about with us as a consultant. Another one, your staff lacks experience or knowledge to manage a fully integrated marketing plan. Sometimes you have a young staff. Sometimes you have a staff, maybe you don't have experience doing recruitment, aggressive recruitment. Maybe that's something your community wants you to do, your strategy calls for it, and then you don't have the experience to do that and you don't have anyone to lean on for it. No commitment for sustainable results. That, how many of you have dealt with board members or elected officials who are impatient? They don't want to wait. They just sit there and say that we're not going to continue to do this and fund this because you should have done something already. They want results today. How many of you feel empowered to represent your community and commit your community to projects? Dave? That's really important as a staff member. Do you have the backing of those stakeholders and elected officials that you represent the community as the quarterback, as we say a lot of times? And the plans aren't actionable. That's a big key. All right, so our process, and again, a lot of strategic planning processes are similar, is discover, analyze, design, align, and deliver. The align piece is important, and I'll talk about it in a second. The most important piece of your strategic planning process, however, is to make sure that you're engaging the stakeholders as it kicks off. The reason for that is because if you're going to take your plan and push the funding that's necessary to implement your plan back out to those stakeholders so that they fund your organization, then they have to have input on the front end. But again, like I said before, if you're not doing that education to help them understand what's important with economic development, that plan's then they're not going to be bought into it. They're going to think that plan should say something else. And how many of you ever heard from a stakeholder, why haven't you gotten us a Target or a Chick-fil-A? That's what we hear most often. And is that what's most important? For some of you, maybe retail is. Maybe retail's your bread and butter. But for most, you're trying to get and create primary jobs that increase those other ancillary jobs within your community. So that's key as far as taking your strategy and pushing it towards funding. Discovery phase is pretty basic. Discovery is when we're looking at doing analysis, pulling data, pulling that quantitative and qualitative analysis that we're going to do later on. We're going to discover all that during this phase. We're going to gather data. We're going to pull from multiple resources on how to analyze your community, understand what your labor looks like, what your growth industries look like, all these different things, so that we can develop strategies that are specific to your community. All that has to be done in order to create a strategy that is actionable long term. Your comprehensive plan should be at least 5 years, and that a lot of times will coincide with what your funding model might look like as well. As we go through our process, I think one of the most important things is the alignment meeting before we deliver, because as a former economic developer, so is Chad, our majority owner, we know what it's like to deal with boards and elected officials. We don't want to embarrass you by delivering something that you feel is not ready for them to see, if it's not worded appropriately, if we make a recommendation, because sometimes we'll make a recommendation to use a specific firm. Say, hey, we've worked with this firm before on engineering, for example. Say we're talking about an industrial side as a strategy. And you say, hey, you can't put them in there because I have an engineering firm we're going to have to use because I want them to contribute to our organization. We do those alignment meetings purposefully with you. And if you have a really good supportive chairperson or other leader in your community, and you want them to be part of that alignment meeting, that's what we want to. We deliver the plan, and I want you to see here, yeah, Ivy, our COO, oh, hey, she just stepped in. She makes our plans look beautiful. I put them all into a Word document because I can't do that. But the implementation plan is the most important. That's the one on the bottom right there. So when you get your plan, you should know what your strategy is. You should know every step of that strategy, how to implement that strategy, And then at the end of that document, you should have an implementation plan that tells you every single year what you should be doing. And each of those action items should have a dollar figure assigned to it. That dollar figure is important because there is no sense in having a strategic plan if you don't know how much it's going to cost to implement it. And there is no sense in having it and knowing what it costs if you can't go out and get the funding for it long term. And we try not to scare people with too much stuff. We also do some other types of planning. These are some folks we've worked with recently. And Colby and Christy, you'll recognize this quote. This is from a congressman I used to work with. A vision without funding is a hallucination. It was his favorite thing to say. He used to be on the House Appropriations Committee. So he appropriated a lot of money to help some visions become more than a hallucination. But in reality, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, it is on you to perform for your communities. You have to know what to do every single day. Your strategy should be there to guide you based on the stakeholders who are employing you. But because they've put that input in, they should be the ones who are also putting the money in to ensure your success. And that's where you go in with Andy or someone like Convergent to work on the next piece.
Thank you. Is it just the green?
Yeah, just hit play.
Thanks, Chuck. So the feasibility study, I know a lot of you are familiar with, but I think one of the mistakes that organizations make, sometimes you might hire a firm or you do an internal process where you're putting together a thorough strategic plan, and then you might have all this amazing feedback, and then you're like, great, we're going to go out and raise money. But they skip this process. They skip the feasibility study, which is, I think, the most important piece of this whole conversation. It is the crux. Ultimately, everything that we do at Convergent revolves around how can we maximize the amount of money that you can raise for your organization. And it doesn't matter if it's us, if it's somebody else, that's fine. But it should be an outside third party that comes in and sits down and has some honest, candid conversations about the organization, about the plan, about your vision, and of course, these are the people that are ultimately going to be funding the vision.
Andy, can I give an example why that's important? This just hit me, and you and I didn't even talk about this.
No.
It's so important that your strategy is laid out before you do this, because if you don't, that feasibility study may not be as accurate. That happened to me. Oh. And people said they would give money, and then when the strategy came out, a lot of those people who said they would give bigger money didn't agree with what the organization was doing. That's why that's so important. And the fundraising campaign fell flat.
Wow.
So.
Well, and one example I'll give you, and that's actually my home state. So North Carolina, just over 10 years ago, the state chamber came up with this huge monster strategic plan. It was awesome. It was very visionary, very looking out, saying, hey, we're growing, there's all these needs, transportation, utilities, all these things that there's nobody in the state that's really leaning in and looking at these things long term. So they had this great plan. They're like, yep, 15 million should do it. And then they ran out and started raising money. Well, the problem was they raised some money, but they got 100,000 here and 50,000 there. They were getting little chunks. It was nowhere near the trajectory that they needed to actually really move the needle. Eventually, somebody introduced me to Lou, and most leaders of organizations, there's no way that they would go back in time and say, well, we've already done the strategic plan. We're already out there raising money. I don't want to have egg on my face. But our recommendation, and it's, I always tell clients, we're going to tell you what you need to hear. Sometimes it's not what you want to hear, but I think that's a sign of a good consultant, that they're going to have those hard conversations. So I had one with Lou. I said, Lou, I know you don't want to hear this, but the best thing for you to do is to actually go back, conduct a feasibility study, really sit down with these individuals and get that honest, candid feedback, that one-on-one honest, candid feedback, and then launch your campaign. I didn't think he'd do it, to be honest. And credit to Lou, he did. And oh boy, we ended up conducting a statewide feasibility study with all the state leaders, business leaders, community leaders. And prior to actually launching their quiet phase of their real fundraising campaign, Wells Fargo came in with $1 million commitment. And to boot, he said, I'm not going out on my own. You're going to need to find a couple others that are going to be at this level as well. So now we had the sense of urgency, we had the pledge at a level that was going to help inspire others, and then Truist came in, Duke Energy came in at 1.5, so now we're at 3.5 million. Now the trajectory is where it's supposed to be. That's the power of going through this process, the power of a thorough feasibility study, because the strategic plan is critical. You need that input from your stakeholders. But ultimately, it boils down to this. When you're looking at funding, which is our role, it's really critical to get the feedback from the people that are writing the checks, right? The people that are going to be underwriting your program of work. Because like Chuck said, if you don't have the funding for this amazing plan, you're not going to be able to move the needle with your organization. That whole process typically takes about 2 to 3 months. And the culmination is, why complete a study? So you know how much water's in the pool before you dive in, right? Really important. Lou started to dive into the pool and wasn't really sure that the 15 million was out there. But it's really critical that once you go through this feasibility study process, you have an idea of how much funding is there. And then ultimately, based on the feedback that you receive, you'll be able to tailor that feedback to the program of work. And I'm not going to read through every bullet here, but basically through a feasibility study, we're looking for 3 things, 3 major things. One is, does your organization have asking rights? What does asking rights mean? It means different things to different people, but for us, it means, do your stakeholders believe strongly in the organization and the staff that if they write a big check, that the money will be well spent and the goals and the programs that you've outlined will be completed, that you will meet or exceed those goals? That's number one. And that's something that we hit right out of the gate. The other piece is, of course, the plan. If you have someone like Next Move Group that's done a thorough plan, typically you'll get pretty good feedback on the program of work. But every once in a while, I mean, my favorite question of the whole feasibility study is, what's missing? What would you like to see maybe that's included that's not included currently? And so the whole idea, again, is not just, hey, here's our plan, give us a check. That's not how you go about maximizing the amount of money that you can raise for your organization. It is, here's where we're thinking about going. This is the feasibility study in a nutshell. But before we take the next step, we've hired, could be Convergent Nonprofit Solutions, it could be somebody else. We've hired somebody to come down and sit down and talk to you and get your impression of the organization and the plan and get their honest, candid feedback prior to going forward. And that is so powerful that you're basically saying, before we go forward, we're not doing a damn thing until we talk to you first. And it's an outside group, so we don't take anybody from the organization, we don't take anyone from the staff, nobody on the board, and it's amazing the information that we glean from this. That's the second big piece. The third piece is leadership. Everyone's probably thinking, wait a minute, what about the funding? The funding is kind of a given. You will need the funding, but as far as looking forward to a successful fundraising campaign, you need the right community leaders that believe so strongly in your organization and this program of work that they're willing to put their name and or their company name behind it to help go make it happen. We know if we get the right leaders behind the program, that they will set the bar high for others to follow, and the right people will get behind the program of work if you get the right key leaders behind it. Those 3 things are the major components that we're looking for in a feasibility study. And ultimately, of course, we want to recommend a goal that is feasible and obtainable, right? That if you can't raise the 15 million, like the original North Carolina Chamber plan, and we can get to 10, then you customize the plan based on how much money you can raise and based on that feedback that you receive from your stakeholders. Because ultimately, if they help you write the plan, very cliche, but it's very true, if they help you write the plan and they've got their fingerprints all over it and they've got ownership of it, they're going to help underwrite it with a check. So there's a handful of things that you can do to really look at the return on investment of your program of work, of the outcomes that it is that your organization is working on, your goals, your benchmarks. Traditional return on investment, everybody knows this inside and out. That's easy stuff. Organizational value proposition is something that's a little bit different. you can look at this in a host of ways, and I'm going to go through a couple of examples here. But this is a little bit more difficult to get to. The traditional model is, hey, we're going to create so many jobs, which is going to increase the tax base, and everybody wins, rising tide. But especially in these days, we're working with organizations that are all of a sudden childcare is somehow, in the strategic plan. We're talking about transportation. You're talking about housing. This is not normal, traditional, at least in years past. And so there's some other ways that you should be looking at the organizational value proposition and the value that the programs that you're trying to raise money for would benefit the community. And if you can tie it back specifically to an organization, that's going to be much better. So the traditional way of fundraising with the return on investment is, you're looking at outputs. But the further you get from the emotional side of things to the other hand side, the bottom line side is really where you're going to, again, raise the most amount of money. The emotional piece is something like hospice, right? I have a soft spot for hospice. Love it. But with really what you're doing, your program of work, you want to be able to quantify the outcomes of the program of work that you have. So most strategic plans, you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 major initiatives, and within those, you've got specific bullets of things that you're trying to do. Everyone wants to know where you're going and how you're going to get there. But if you really want to maximize the amount of money that you can raise for your organization, you need to not only just look at outputs, you need to take it a level further and look at outcomes. And then if you can even take it further and narrow that down to the specific companies and organizations that you're talking to, that's the sweet spot. That is where you will really be able to get people to sit up and take notice and invest in your program of work. So we're going to talk through a couple of examples. Again, this is the traditional return on investment methodology where, this is Alamance County, right around the corner. 1,500 jobs, the $30 an hour wage, and then you can do all this arithmetic. And this is good stuff. We can go to Food Line around the corner in North Carolina and say, hey, based on this program of work, based on all these new jobs and all these people spending all this additional money, this is going to be the economic impact to not the community, but to you, the business. Specifically, hey, Truist Bank, you've got 30% market share. If our organization meets our goals and we get to the promised land and do all these things, this is going to be the impact to your organization. That, again, that's difficult to do. It takes time. But if you can get to that stage, that's where you'll really move the needle. The organizational value proposition, though, is a different duck. It's a different animal. The direct and indirect economic impacts, that's the easy stuff, right? That's the stuff we just talked about. But here's the juicy stuff, and here's where we're really starting to dig into. If you can quantify things like values lost if actions aren't taken. A lot of people aren't comfortable having this conversation. I love having this conversation. This is the best. You're talking sense of urgency. Hey, if we do not get the money that we need to implement this program of work for these needs that this community is looking for, there will be impacts, right? But guess what? They're not good ones. If we don't raise the money, if we do not address this need in this community, there's going to be downstream effects that are not going to be pretty. It's okay to have those conversations. You should have those conversations, but they're going to be more impactful if you can quantify that information, right? Not just talk about it in the generic form. So if you can quantify that, that's where you need to be, and that's where you should be. Beyond that, societal benefits enhanced, cost avoided, quality of life impacts, again, may not be specific to each one of these bullets for your program of work, but there are specific buckets of value that you can look at that, again, if you can then quantify some of these, this is really where you want to be. And again, I think it's a little bit of change in mindset. It's definitely very difficult as you're looking at whatever your program of work is, but each organization will have different buckets of value that if you can really look through your program of work and then look at not the outputs, like, hey, we're going to do X amount of this, but looking at further downstream, the outcomes, that's really where you will be able to maximize the amount of money that you can raise for your organization. So there's a handful of examples here, some of, more traditional examples, increasing staff, the additional jobs, economic impact. But right now, I think probably the number one thing we're raising money for across the country is either workforce, talent attraction, talent retention. And so there are things that you can do in that regard to quantify the impacts of the program of work that you're implementing right now that will benefit you going forward and as you're having conversations with your key stakeholders. Cultural improvements, again, not as easy to quantify, but again, if you can get down to the details in that specific area, that will help as you're communicating the value to your stakeholders. And then these are the couple of things that I just talked about in the previous slide, the societal benefits enhanced, negative outcomes minimized. This is a fun one. I mean, you're really looking at, again, downstream impacts of reducing blighted areas in the community, reducing crime, increasing graduation rates for education. There's a lot of impacts for all of these things, but most companies and organizations aren't really digging to that kind of level of detail to figure out what those impacts are. But if you can, then that's where, again, you want to be. I've talked through the negative costs avoided already, but the organizational value proposition is very powerful stuff. A couple quick case studies. The Burlington Partnership, again, talking through the importance of the feasibility study and not just creating a plan and then running out and raising money based on that plan. We had a jobs goal of 1,000 jobs. And ultimately, there were a lot of manufacturers, they were saying, what are you guys doing? You're going to recruit another 1,000 jobs? Like, we can't fill all the jobs that we have now. So they were not happy with the plan, and they were saying, you don't need to recruit because we've got lots of jobs here that are unfilled. That's our pain point. So ultimately, in the actual fundraising campaign, they updated the plan to reduce the number of recruited jobs, which is something that really resonated with them. But then the other piece is they created a goal that they were going to reduce by 25% the number of open jobs. Now, what do you think, when we went back to talk to those manufacturers in the fundraising campaign, how do you think they felt? A lot of them, they didn't expect us to change a thing. They just figured, yeah, whatever, you're just going to come back here and ask for money, blah, 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 I know the routine. But now you've got their attention, right? Now you listened. It's like, yes, we reduced this, and we're going to help you fill these jobs that you're having trouble fill. They created an unbelievably robust talent attraction and retention program. And now what are they going to do? They're like, well, hot damn, you actually listened. A lot of them didn't expect that they would listen. But again, just doing those simple things that transition from plan, public input, to specific input, and then acting on it, listening, and then updating the plan to reflect the feedback. Because ultimately where you want to be is where it's not just a plan that you create and then go out and ask for money. Ultimately, it will turn into a community plan, and they've got their fingerprints all over it. And back to the earlier quote, if they help write the plan, they're going to help underwrite the plan. Roanoke Regional Partnership, one of my favorites. Is John here? John Hull? He was here. I think he skipped out. All right, well, John's mud. I actually managed their campaign, which was the last one that I'd personally managed, but just over 10 years ago, Roanoke had a very bold vision. And to me, it was a little outside the box, right? They wanted to raise money to do a lot of things to promote the region. Their population was flat as a pancake for many years. They really wanted to, which is a lot of the buzzword now, talent attraction and retention. But they created a 501c3. So within their economic development organization, they now host an outdoor marathon that they branded the toughest road marathon. They have created an outdoor festival, Go Outside, all through their foundation. They really wanted to promote Roanoke region as a great place to live, work, and play, one. Number two, they wanted to put Roanoke on the map. For anyone that's outside of Virginia, just show of hands, how many people know where Roanoke, Virginia is? A lot of people have no clue. And so It was interesting, though, doing the feasibility study because a lot of individuals were like, wait a minute, this is not traditional economic development. I don't know if this is something that makes sense. But people bought in. They said, okay, we're going to give it a shot, see how it goes. So this is private sector funding. They raised just under $3 million just over 10 years ago. And it started to really pick up steam. A lot of the things that they were doing started to resonate. The last campaign was about 3.3 million. This last one, which by the way was 2021, coming out of COVID, going into 2022, it was over 4.2 million. Carilion Hospital, that used to be $40,000 a year, is now $120,000 per year. So the idea behind this whole long story is, if you create a strong strategic plan, you get that candid feedback, and then you act on that, and you follow through with your mission, and your community leaders and your stakeholders feel part of the process, and they fund that process, and then as John and his team have done over the years, they're meeting all their goals and benchmarks and more. And right here is the culmination of all of that hard work. They are crushing it. And the coolest part about this story, public sector and Roanoke, they match. Whatever we raise from the private sector, so this is a double dip right here. I mean, this is another $1 million from the private sector. This is over 5 years, by the way. This is not an annual number. But now you've got a match from the public sector. So again, this is the sweet spot where you want to be. If you do see John running around, definitely talk to him, because they have really knocked it out of the park. Chuck, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, I mean, we just wanted to make sure you all had some strong takeaways. And if you were in any of the sessions I was in yesterday, if you're a YP or an OP who snuck into the YP, I kind of like to tell it how it is. And, flat out, your organization doesn't exist without funding. You have to have funding to operate and to be successful long term. And your job doesn't exist without results. Some leaders are more patient than others, but you've got to have results. And the best way to get that is through a strategy. The funding fuels the strategy drives results, it communicates your value to maximize funding, but you have to deliver what you promise. And I think Andy has talked about that a lot through some of these examples. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and you all are going to start seeing this more and more, and I didn't think this would ever happen myself, economic development strategies are more and more becoming all-encompassing beyond the traditional things that we all consider. So jobs, investment, quality jobs with certain wage goals, those sorts of things. Childcare is in almost every strategy we do now because it's such a massive problem on the workforce side. And what we find is we'll go into a community and sometimes we'll end up doing a survey to figure out why people aren't working in that community. And childcare comes down as one of those. Not just childcare. Sometimes we find out they have adult dependents. All of these different things are impacting your industries, which are your stakeholders, which are your funders, your check writers. So you have to understand that all of this connects together. You don't have to use a professional to do this. I have done this. When I was ran an EDO, I ended up writing up my own strategy. A funding agency was hired before that, and I told you earlier they didn't do the feasibility study right, so I had to get rid of them. It wasn't Convergent. I like them. And you would have, okay, I got to tell you something.
Oh, no.
They sent a guy in, and I swear to you, he worked for a university, and I'm not going to say what state it was in because you might know him. But he came in, and I was in eastern Kentucky, and they cut through the rock to make roads there. You got to cut through the mountain. And he asked me, he was dead serious. He said, "Oh, Chuck, I saw the signs that said it's a falling rock zone. Does that mean I need to get away from that wall and stay in that other lane?" And I said, "Are you serious?" I almost said his name. I said, No, it just means that rocks could fall. You don't have to drive on the shoulder in the grass, you weirdo. Have you ever been out of Mississippi? No, I was kidding.
Oh, no.
And then, sorry, I shouldn't have said that either. But I ended up getting rid of them, and I was brand new. I had just been hired as a president of this organization. It was just forming. And I called the chairman and I said, "Hey, look, I got tired of this guy. He's embarrassed me in too many meetings. He thought rocks was going to hit his car every time he drove down the road. I fired him. How mad are you at me?" And he said, "I know you're the right leader because I wanted you to fire him like a month ago. I'm glad you did it." So again, make sure that you're connecting the right people. having the right people on your side, the right professionals who know what they're doing, because it helps a lot. And you know, from our perspective, whether it's our site selection experience that assists you, or our economic development experience where we've been in your shoes before, and then Andy and them your firm has done this so many times in so many places, you can bring an amount of best practices that are important. And one of the things that when we were talking, the reason we wanted to do this together was because if you noticed, when he was discussing the feasibility piece and being able to go back and that's almost a part of a discovery phase, like the strategic plan.
Right.
And if you're marrying those two together, then you're maximizing your results. And that's really why we wanted to share that with you all today. And we wanted to leave some time for questions if anybody has questions about things that we've seen. So. None? I don't see anybody's hands up. Nobody's rushing to the microphones. Nobody has any questions. Perfect. I love it.
We were very clear.
We were very clear.
Everyone understands?
Well, if you want to hear some horror stories about some planning sessions that we've done in the past, things that occur when you're meeting with stakeholders, you would be surprised, maybe not, at the things that we're told when we get into these one-on-one things. We had a guy one time, we used to write down everything. We'd get in these one-on-one, we call them coffee cup conversations with your stakeholders, and we'll sit there and talk to them one-on-one. We're writing it down, and the guy sitting across from us just clammed up. He said, I feel like I'm in a deposition. I don't want to tell you nothing. So we quit doing that. We quit writing everything down. We just try to retain, go quick, and then we put our notes down afterwards. We want them to be comfortable and willing to share. But what happens is they share a little too much sometimes. So we hear the good, bad, and the ugly, and we want to make sure that you all hear what your stakeholders are giving us in return. That feedback is important for you because then it gets transferred to what can be accomplished from the feasibility study and the funding.
Right.
Appreciate you all having us today. Thank you.